So, one of the biggest concepts around the whole identity profile, which moves away from a single typing system, is to not only lean into the idea of what your most efficient number is going to be, your headquarters, your home base, the place that you go to sleep and you wake up every night and every morning. We know that's a part of who you are. But we also want to talk about what is the experience as a human being when you encounter a number that may be very low for you? And what is the difference in that relationship between somebody who expresses a number high or efficiently, or they express it low or inefficient? What does it look like for us to have conversations around what happens to you if somebody interferes with your highest number? And what happens if somebody introduces your lowest number? Does it trigger you in a similar way, or can it have a trigger? What does it look like to be really efficient and really strong and really effective in a high number, but then be struggling to introduce or to utilize that number if it's low for you? So long story short, this series is going to be about conversations in each of the numbers as it relates to when it's high for you, when it's low for you, how it impacts you if somebody interferes with that goal, or if somebody introduces that unfamiliar space. Thanks for joining. So welcome everybody to a conversation around a space and an energy and a nature I am somewhat familiar with, which is a 2 space. Happens to be my most efficient space. So we're going to see if we can keep this video to a short length, but at the same time, try not to trigger everybody who's low in a 2. Because the reality is, every single number has the capacity to be life-giving or life-threatening. We know that in a space of a 2 that you have the capacity to nurture. You have the motivation to seek out appreciation, increasing the value of yourself and those around you, and the things that you touch, and the things that you steward, and the people that you serve. But you also have the gift of unconditional love. Like, what does it look like to have somebody walk into your space that you've never met and be able to go, I got no problem loving that person. I got no problem being in a space with that person. I've got no problem with serving or stewarding a space with that person. But then if you're low in a 2, you're inefficient in that language. What about what I just said over the last 45 seconds felt triggering? What about the word like nurture and unconditional love and appreciation and value building and service and stewardship and all those different languages that I use, that dialect specific to 2? Why all of a sudden does it feel like you might be annoyed or irritated or feeling pushback? This is again the nature of, if you're efficient in a 2, your lifetime of lived experiences, not only your nature, genetically and your predisposition of how you came into the world, but your nurture, your epigenetic expression of that particular space. As an identical twin, I can promise you, and science has proven, epigenetics is a real thing. So if you're a family member and you're a sibling and people have told you guys are going to be the same number because you're in the same household, not scientifically accurate. We can debate that all day. The science will prove you wrong. It does not matter if you're born in the same house. Epigenetics is a real thing. And based on your personal perspective, your own lived experience in terms of how you encountered the world, you can be in the exact same environment with 2 completely different experiences, and those experiences will dictate how your genes show up. And then on top of that, what's the discipline-based conditioning? What about your lived experiences said, if I continue to be in the presence of nurturing spaces, or I continue to provide some degree of help to those around me, I increase my chances of survival, or I mitigate the amount of pain that I might experience? Because remember, if you're efficient in a number, you can either be reproducing or reinforcing a space that felt rewarding, or you can be reframing a particular trauma or negative experience that felt life-threatening. So when you figured out how to reframe that and how to reintroduce or to reproduce a healthier version of it, all of a sudden the things in those spaces that felt uncomfortable started to go down. So when you learn that being nurturing, being helpful, being loving, being whatever that space needed you to be, being needed, all of a sudden the pain and the experiences that felt uncomfortable started to go down. Or you just happened to be fortunate to be in a space where somebody really showed you what it feels like to be loved, to be nurtured. Not everybody has that space. Not everybody has the opportunity to be in a place where they're like, I know what it feels like for another human being to unconditionally love me in a healthy way. That oftentimes is a very rare experience. So these are the ways to kind of look at, why did I become efficient in a 2? Why did it feel like this was a good strategy? Either because I'm reproducing a reward and it feels life-giving, or I'm reframing and changing something that felt like a pain, and I'm trying to mitigate the encounters that I have with that. But if you're low in a 2, what in your lived experience said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I have no experience and no encounter with somebody being nurturing, a primary caregiver being unconditionally loving, somebody saying, I know what it looks like to support you in a way that says, I'm going to build value in you and I'm going to build value in the environment. That kind of space, especially you as a person having a value attribution, it's like you're speaking a language I literally don't understand because it may not have been an environment that you encountered or you experienced. So when we talk about highs and lows with 2s, if you're high in a 2 and somebody interferes with your capacity to love another person, somebody interferes with your desire to nurture, or your exercising of the natural capacity to nurture and to build and to help and to serve and to steward, what happens to you? What version of you shows up? What happens if somebody depreciates you or doesn't appreciate you or appreciates someone else for the work that you did? What version of you shows up when all of a sudden you don't feel valued or you don't feel valuable? It's a really interesting space to consider if you're high in a 2. What triggers you and what is the antonym to that when all of a sudden you don't feel like you have value, you don't feel like you're being nurtured, and you don't feel like you're being understood in a loving and unconditional way? Now, if you're low in a 2, this is going to be a really different encounter for you. You got to remember, when you're low in any number, again, to reinforce this, it's either because you don't know what it looks like for that to be rewarding and fulfilling, or you definitely know what that feels like for it to be risky. And either you didn't pursue it because it doesn't feel life-giving, or you're definitely avoiding it because it feels life-threatening and you found a way to get away from that particular space and not to revisit it. Remember, being in a 2 and being low in a 2 might be that you never traveled to the country that deals with nurturing and you don't know what the anthem of unconditional love and appreciation feels like, or you lived in that particular space for a period of time, or you had a parent that was from that particular space, or a caregiver or a really influential person in your life growing up that spoke, sang, and practiced the space of 2 nature and 2 country anthem, and you're like, I don't want to live there. That is not something that feels viable for me. So you moved out and you moved away. And when's the last time that you visited? When's the last time that you traveled to that space? Because you may have built the protocol to avoid a 2 space 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. But your brain doesn't know the difference between past, present, and future. It only deals with present. So if you had a memory 60 years ago around somebody who smothered you in unhealthy and manipulative ways, and they were overbearing and intoxicatingly stifling, like somebody puts on way too much cologne and too much perfume, and they just want to hover over you and be that nurturing force in a way that feels suffocating. And you're like, I'm out. I disconnected from that space and I moved away. Or everything that I just described to you in terms of healthy 2 nature for nurturing, loving, and appreciating is just not something you were raised in. So you've just never visited that space. It may be that it's low for you because you just don't know what it looks like. So my encouragement when we're talking about highs and lows around 2s is, if you are high in a 2, one of the things that can be really helpful for you to do is to go, what does it look like for me to pull back and to restrain the natural orientation that I have for loving people, nurturing spaces, building appreciation, and being in that space where I can both steward and serve people? Because here's the thing, you may have the gift of unconditional love, but you got to remember, no conditions means no boundaries. And no boundaries means you don't know how to say no. And if you don't know how to say no, you're not going to be effective in using your resources in a healthy and appropriate way. Boundaries exist for a reason. And when you don't practice boundaries and you move into an 8 space and you get angry, anger is a boundary that has been crossed. And the problem for most 2s is you never set a boundary, so you don't know when it's been crossed until it's exceeded your capacity. And now you're dealing with a fatigue response because you've been triggered. You can rewind that, listen to it again, because there's a lot there if you're high in a 2, because I'm hearing it as much as I'm telling it to you. So I have to be conscientious of this as well. But if you're low in a 2, what does it look like for you to be aware that as soon as somebody introduces love, especially unconditional love, all of a sudden your guard goes up. You get defensive, you get triggered, you get uncomfortable, because why are they valuing me? What do they need? What are they trying to do? Are they trying to ingratiate me? Are they trying to manipulate me? I don't have healthy encounters with 2, so this feels foreign. It feels weird. It's a dialect I don't speak. It's going to take me a second to understand. So as you work through these spaces, being able to be in a place where you can encounter language around nurture, support, love, appreciation, value building. If those words don't come naturally to you, what does it look like to allow yourself to even consider those relationships? Because remember, perception is reality, and your brain does not know the difference between a threat and a perceived possibility of a life-threatening space, a bear and a deadline. So when somebody says that they love you or they appreciate your work, what do you do in terms of dismissing it? What do you do in terms of setting up a guard or a boundary to say, I don't trust that? So have a conversation, whether you're high or low in a 2, around how much your demand or your need or your requirement for love, appreciation, value building, and nurturing, and need, and space, and gratitude exists, and how much you're just not interested in that, and why. And again, as always, it's important to remember this is one of those times where leaning into support and leaning into community is going to be really important. Because we understand in that 2 space, it is not about isolation, and it is not about doing it on your own. It's about being in a relationship with other people, not only nurturing them, but nurturing ourselves. Not only loving others, but loving ourselves. And not only valuing others, but valuing ourselves. And whether you're high or low in a 2, those words, those frameworks are going to be something that we need to consider. And it may be an idea to consider that with a partner, with a spouse, with a counselor, with a therapist, with a pastor, with a spiritual director. Also remember, you can lean into the thesaurus exercise, which is a chance of taking some of these words and figuring out what synonyms work for you. And once you find the synonyms that feel life-giving, scroll down, look at those antonyms, and boom, you're going to automatically be able to recognize what a trigger is, and then have a conversation about investigating and unpacking why those connections exist. Thanks so much.